On the morning of August the 27th, 1975, an old man lay dying in his own palace, not in a royal bed, but under house arrest. The Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I, known to millions as the Lion of Judah, had been imprisoned for nearly a year by the military junta that had deposed him. His personal physician, Professor Asrat Voldayes, was denied access. Later that day, the military announced he was dead. But the story of how the mighty fall is not simply one of power lost. It is a story of trust destroyed, of laws broken, of agreements shattered, of one man who betrayed a people and a people who, in turn, betrayed their emperor. How did the revered Lion of Judah end up caged in the very palace where he had ruled for 44 years, and who bears the blame? In this episode, we are going to unravel this detective story, hidden inside a history lesson. Welcome to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, the podcast where we look what is behind well-known stories and myths. I'm your host, and this is the story of Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia, who lived and died by the sword of broken trust. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll investigate three central betrayals: how a military junta promised one thing and did another, how an emperor broke a solemn international agreement with his own neighbors, and how a modernizing leader failed his own people during a man-made famine while the world watched in horror. By the end, we'll have a clear answer to our central question: who betrayed whom? And we'll uncover a troubling myth about Haile Selassie that has clouded history, the false idea that he opposed all modernization and change. The truth is far more complex and far more tragic. Let's begin in September 1974, on a day when a nation that had fought off European conquest and reclaimed its independence from Italian occupation was about to lose its ancient throne. Picture Ethiopia in early 1974. Emperor Haile Selassie was 82 years old. He had ruled as emperor for 44 years since 1930, and before that, he had served as regent from 1916. He was not just a politician. He was seen by millions, especially Rastafarians in Jamaica and across the Caribbean, as a divine incarnation, a living god. His title read like a poem: King of Kings, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, Haile Selassie, which means power of the Trinity. Yet by 1974, Ethiopia was in crisis. In the northern provinces of Wollo and Tigray, a devastating drought had swept across the land. Peasants were dying of starvation. Inflation had gripped the economy. Oil prices had surged. In the capital, students, many educated in Western universities, were demanding land reform, an end to feudalism, and democratic freedoms. The military was restless, poorly paid, and angered by their defeats in Eritrea, a former Italian colony that the emperor had annexed in 1962, triggering what would become Africa's longest war of liberation. The emperor, for decades, the undisputed master of his realm, was losing control. In February 1974, mutinies broke out in the imperial army. By June, a shadowy military committee had formed, the Derg, or Committee, in Amharic. It operated in the shadows, arresting government officials and military officers one by one. It was not a loud coup. It was a creeping coup, a slow strangulation of imperial authority that would culminate on one day, September 12, 1974. On that day, a blue Volkswagen pulled up to the Jubilee Palace. Inside sat Emperor Haile Selassie, ready for another day of rule. Outside, youths ran after the car, hurling insults. The emperor was driven not to his council chambers, but to army headquarters, where an officer read him a simple proclamation: "You are deposed." Contemporary reports from international news agencies describe him taking the news calmly, saying only that he had served his country in war and peace, and if he was to be removed, he accepted it. But acceptance and betrayal are not opposites. They can coexist. This chapter answers: did the Derg truly intend to preserve the monarchy, and when did they decide to destroy it? When the Derg arrested Emperor Haile Selassie on September 12, 1974, they made a public announcement: the monarchy would be preserved, a constitutional monarchy. The emperor's son, Crown Prince Asfa, who was in Geneva recovering from a severe stroke he had suffered in late 1972, would be returned to Ethiopia and installed as a constitutional king, ruling but not governing, much like modern monarchs in Europe. According to diplomatic cables and later historical summaries, this was presented as a compromise between revolution and continuity. The Derg even chose a chairman, General Aman Endom, a Sandhurst-educated military officer, seen as moderate and relatively loyal to the imperial tradition. Aman Endom opposed the radical executions that other Derg members wanted. He favored a negotiated settlement with Eritrean rebels and supported the idea of a constitutional monarchy. Archival material and later interviews with former officials indicate that this was, at least for some officers, a genuine, if short-lived, plan. But within weeks, everything changed. On November 23, 1974, a night that became known as Black Saturday, the Derg transported about 60 high-ranking officials and members of the imperial household to a prison in Addis Ababa. According to human rights reports and later court records from trials of former Derg members, they were lined up and shot without trial. Bodies were hastily buried in mass graves covered with quicklime. Among the dead were generals, ministers, and members of Emperor Haile Selassie's own family. General Aman Endom himself was killed that same night along with his supporters. He had clashed with the radical wing of the Derg over these very executions and over the war in Eritrea. The radicals won. With his death, the last significant military advocate for a constitutional monarchy was eliminated. By March 1975, just 6 months after the coup, the Derg issued a formal proclamation abolishing the monarchy entirely. Not reforming it. Not limiting it. Abolishing it. Draft constitutional proposals that had circulated in the last months of the imperial regime aimed at transforming Ethiopia into a constitutional monarchy were quietly shelved. So did the Derg lie from the beginning, or did it change course? The evidence suggests something more chilling. There were genuine moderates like Aman Endom who believed in a constitutional path, and there were hardliners who saw such moderation as a threat. The radicals systematically removed the moderates, then dismantled the institution they had promised to preserve. The promised constitutional monarchy was a bridge that was never meant to be built. It died in blood on November 23, 1974. What does it mean for a revolution to begin with a promise of law, and so quickly abandon law for bullets? This chapter answers, how did Haile Selassie break faith with the people of Eritrea, and what was the cost? To understand Haile Selassie's own betrayals, we must travel back in time to 1952, more than a decade after Ethiopian and British forces had driven out Mussolini's army and restored Haile Selassie to Addis Ababa. Italy's occupation of Ethiopia from 1936 to 1941 had briefly made Ethiopia part of Italian East Africa, but the country regained its independence in 1941, becoming a symbol of African resistance to European rule. Across the Red Sea coast lay Eritrea, which had been an Italian colony since the late 19th century. After World War II, the newly formed United Nations was tasked with deciding Eritrea's fate. Should it become independent, remain under British military administration, or join Ethiopia? In 1952, the UN chose a middle path, a federation between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Under this arrangement, Eritrea would join Ethiopia under the emperor's sovereignty, but keep its own parliament, its own constitution, and its own official languages, Tigrinya and Arabic. UN archives and Eritrean historical accounts describe this as a compromise designed to respect Eritrean identity while satisfying Ethiopian strategic concerns. For a decade, this federation existed on paper and, to a degree, in practice. But Haile Selassie had different ambitions. According to Eritrean memoirs and the work of historians like Martin Plaut, the emperor made his position brutally clear in private. He wanted the land and the sea, not an autonomous Eritrean polity. It was not a slip of the tongue, it was a guiding principle. From the mid-1950s onward, the emperor's government began systematically dismantling the federal structure. Eritrean trade unions were suppressed. Student protests were met with force. In 1958, a major workers' demonstration in Asmara was fired upon. Workers were killed and hundreds injured, as reported in contemporaneous accounts by Eritrean activists. Then, on November 14, 1962, Haile Selassie took the decisive step. Ethiopian troops surrounded the Eritrean parliament in Asmara. Under that pressure, the parliament voted to dissolve the federation and unite Eritrea fully with Ethiopia. Within days, the emperor abolished the Eritrean constitution, disbanded its parliament, and imposed Amharic as the primary language of administration, curtailing the public use of Tigrinya and Arabic. The United Nations, which had brokered the federation, lodged no effective protest. Cold War priorities trumped the rights of one small Red Sea territory. Eritreans did not quietly accept this betrayal. In fact, armed resistance had already begun. On September 1st, 1961, a small guerrilla band led by Hamid Idris Awate had attacked an Ethiopian police post at Mount Adal, an event widely regarded in Eritrean histories as the spark of the liberation struggle. After annexation in 1962, that struggle intensified. Over the next 30 years, the war in Eritrea would claim more than 200,000 lives. Ethiopian troops and Eritrean fighters alike inflicted and endured terrible violence. Human rights reports document massacres of civilians, village burnings, and mass arrests. One such episode in 1967 saw thousands of Eritrean civilians killed as collective punishment after guerrilla attacks. Haile Selassie had taken a UN-crafted federal compromise and, by force, turned it into de facto annexation. He had broken an international agreement and extinguished the limited autonomy Eritreans had been promised. The betrayal of Eritrea was not only a legal breach, it was a moral rupture that would haunt Ethiopia for decades, draining its treasury, destabilizing its politics, and feeding the anger that revolutionary movements, civilian and military, would later harness against the imperial regime. If an emperor can tear up a treaty backed by the United Nations, what message does that send to his own people about the value of any promise? This chapter answers, how did a modernizing emperor allow a man-made famine to kill 250,000 people? Here is where we confront a powerful myth and correct it. The myth goes like this. Haile Selassie was a rigid, backward autocrat who rejected all modernization and change. In this view, Ethiopia was medieval until the Derg swept away feudalism and brought progress. The historical record tells a different story. From the 1920s onward, Haile Selassie cultivated a reputation as a modernizer. Proclamations published in the 1940s show him abolishing slavery by law in 1942. Educational records from his reign list new schools and even a university, Haile Selassie First University in Addis Ababa. Hospitals were founded. A 1931 constitution, Ethiopia's first written constitution, followed by a more expansive 1955 constitution, promised separation of powers, personal liberties, and a legislature with an elected chamber. These documents were written in formal legal language, but their meaning was clear. Ethiopia would not remain frozen in feudal time. The tragedy, as legal and political analyses have shown, is that many of these reforms were more on paper than in practice. The emperor retained broad powers. Land remained concentrated in the hands of the crown, the church, and a small aristocratic elite. And the very educational reforms he championed produced a generation of students who, by the 1960s, began openly criticizing the imperial system. Studies on the Ethiopian student movement describe how these young people used the emperor's own language of justice and modernization to demand land reform and democracy. That is the backdrop to the famine of 1972-1975. In the northern provinces of Wollo and Tigray, drought struck in 1972. Harvests failed. Peasants who had lived on the brink of subsistence saw their fragile margin vanish. According to demographic studies of the period and the article on the Wollo famine, between 40,000 and 80,000 people died in the early phase, with some estimates placing the total death toll by 1975 at around 250,000. But drought alone did not kill them. A study hosted by the Harvard Map Collection observes that the imperial government ignored and suppressed information about starvation in Wollo and Tigray, and that international aid organizations, hoping to preserve good relations with a friendly government, downplayed or delayed the alarming data. In plain language, people were starving, and those in power, at home and abroad, looked away. The same research notes a striking figure. Information about the famine took 320 days to reach the emperor in a clear, actionable way. When questioned later, the provincial governor of Wollo claimed he had been busy with administrative duties in the capital and had not visited the worst-affected rural districts. Meanwhile, along the roads of Wollo, famine victims began to collapse and die in public, making the disaster impossible to hide. Journalists eventually reached the region. In November 1973, the New York Times reported that thousands were starving and that the catastrophe had been allowed to fester in silence. The structure of landholding made everything worse. Land tenure studies from the time show that many peasants were tenants, handing over as much as 3/4 of their harvest to landlords, often the church, the crown, or large landowners tied to the imperial system. In a good year, this was barely survivable. In a bad year, it was lethal. Haile Selassie, the modernizer who had abolished slavery and built schools, presided over a state that failed in its most basic duty, to protect its people from a foreseeable, preventable disaster. Whether he personally grasped the scale of the famine in time is still debated. Some accounts depict an aging ruler isolated by courtiers and bureaucracy. Others suggest he discounted or delayed action on grim reports. What is not debated is the outcome. Tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands, died while the imperial state moved slowly and guarded its image. This was not genocide. It was not deliberate starvation. But it was a profound breach of the social contract. A betrayal of the implicit promise that a ruler will shoulder the burden in times of crisis. If the emperor could not, or would not, save his people from hunger, why should they save his throne? This chapter answers, did the Derg murder Haile Selassie, and what do we actually know about his death? For 1 year, from September 1974 to August 1975, Haile Selassie lived under house arrest in the Jubilee Palace. The residence that had been his seat of power became a gilded cage. He was in his early 80s. According to later interviews with his personal physician, Professor Azrat Wold-Eyes, and accounts by palace staff, the emperor had undergone a prostate operation months earlier, but had recovered and was in reasonably stable health for his age. On August 27, 1975, the Dergs announced that Haile Selassie was dead. The official cause, given in government statements and repeated in state media, was complications from that previous prostate surgery. From the start, there were doubts. Professor Azrat publicly challenged the official narrative, pointing out that the surgery had taken place months before, not days, and that there had been no sign of a sudden medical crisis. Palace staff noticed strange details. One of them, a long-serving butler, later described seeing Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, the rising power inside the Derg, pacing the corridor near the emperor's rooms on the night before the death was announced. The Derg regime fell in 1991 after a prolonged civil war. With the junta gone, a new government in Addis Ababa began slowly to investigate past crimes. In 2006, during a major trial of former Derg officials on charges including genocide and crimes against humanity, a large body of testimony about the emperor's final days was finally heard in court. Among that testimony, as summarized in legal reports and historical overviews, was a chilling claim. Former Derg members testified under oath that on August 23, 1975, 4 days before the announced death, a group of officers decided that His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie should be strangled because they considered him a continuing symbol of oppression and imperialism. No independent autopsy was ever performed in 1975. The Derg tightly controlled access to the body. Official records cited natural causes, critics spoke of murder. The truth remained murky, and crucially, there was no physical proof. That changed with the discovery after the regime's fall. In 1991, rebel forces entered Addis Ababa. The Derg collapsed, and Mengistu fled into exile. The following year, on February 17, 1992, workers doing construction at the National Palace complex uncovered human remains beneath a concrete floor in a small outbuilding. Subsequent investigation by Ethiopian authorities identified those remains as belonging to Haile Selassie. The deposed emperor had been buried in a shallow, unmarked grave inside the palace compound itself. So the timeline is this. 1975, Haile Selassie dies in custody. The Derg announces natural causes. 1991, the Derg is overthrown. 1992, his hidden remains are discovered at the palace. 2000, He receives a formal reburial in Holy Trinity Cathedral, Addis Ababa. 2006. Former Derg officials testify in court that his death had been planned as a deliberate killing. The evidence does not provide a medically documented cause of death. What it does provide is a pattern, a regime that denied independent examination, disposed of the body in secret beneath a palace building, and then, decades later, saw some of its own members testify that they had decided to kill the former emperor. Even if one were to doubt the exact manner of death, whether he was strangled, suffocated, or died of neglect, the political reality is clear. Haile Selassie died as a prisoner of men who had promised to respect the monarchy and the rule of law, and then buried him in silence beneath the stones of his own house. What does justice look like when the dead cannot speak and the living change their stories over time? So, where does this leave us? We have traced a chain of broken promises. Haile Selassie, the modernizer, who helped restore Ethiopia's independence after Italian occupation and spoke eloquently at the League of Nations and later the United Nations, committed his own profound betrayals. He broke an international federal arrangement with Eritrea backed by the UN. He maintained a feudal land structure that left peasants at the mercy of drought. His state failed catastrophically during the Wollo famine, while officials downplayed or concealed the scale of disaster. The Derg, claiming to rescue Ethiopia from imperial oppression, in turn betrayed its own stated principles. It promised a constitutional monarchy, then abolished the monarchy. It talked of justice, then executed dozens of officials and family members without trial on a single night. It claimed to act on behalf of the people, then presided over the Red Terror and years of civil war. Underlying all of this is a deeper dynamic, the betrayal of expectations created by law and by rhetoric. Haile Selassie's constitutions of 1931 and 1955 contained words about representation, about rights, about the structure of government that raised expectations among educated Ethiopians. His schools and university created a generation of students who took those words seriously. When they demanded genuine land reform and meaningful participation, the imperial system responded with repression. The emperor had sown the seeds of change, but was unwilling to share the harvest. The Derg rose on a wave of anger at imperial failure, especially over famine and feudalism. But once in power, its leaders discovered the same temptation that haunts revolutions everywhere, the urge to protect the revolution by destroying its own constraints. Moderates like General Aman Andom were removed. Hardliners like Mengistu prevailed. The promises of early communiques were eroded by the logic of centralizing power. We already mentioned, the myth of Haile Selassie as a purely backward, anti-modern despot must be set aside. The historical record shows a ruler who did modernize. He abolished slavery by decree, created modern schools and a university, sponsored written constitutions, joined international organizations, and hosted the founding of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. At the same time, he preserved a deeply unequal land system, tolerated authoritarian practices, and used security forces to suppress dissent. His modernization was partial and often contradictory. He embraced the image of a forward-looking emperor, but resisted reforms that would have truly limited his power. The students who challenged him in the 1960s and early 1970s were, in many cases, his own creations, beneficiaries of the Western-style education he had expanded. Seeing Haile Selassie only as either saint or tyrant misses that tragic complexity. He was a modernizer whose half-measures and broken promises helped bring about the revolution that destroyed him. Beyond Ethiopia, Haile Selassie has another life, in the faith of Rastafarians around the world. Drawing on biblical prophecy and his Solomonic lineage, they came to see him as a divine figure, a messianic king. When news of his overthrow and later his death reached Jamaica and other centers of Rastafarian belief, it posed a profound theological challenge. Many did not accept that a living God could be killed by a military junta. Instead, they reframed his disappearance. The physical body, they said, was only a vessel. The spiritual reality of Jah, God, was not bound to the palace in Addis Ababa or to the institutions of Ethiopian monarchy. Haile Selassie's apparent defeat at the hands of soldiers became, in this reading, another example of worldly powers failing to understand divine truth. Whether one sees this as faith, metaphor, or both, it shows how the same life can sustain radically different stories. In Ethiopia, a fallen emperor; in the Rastafarian world, an undying spiritual presence. Why does the story of Haile Selassie matter now? Because the pattern we have seen, grand promises written into constitutions, solemn treaties signed before the world, stirring speeches about modernization and justice, followed by betrayal and practice, is not confined to mid-20th century Ethiopia. Today, across continents, citizens watch leaders adopt new constitutions, sign peace agreements, pledge reforms, and then fail to implement them. Land reform stalls, corruption persists, courts remain under political pressure. The details differ, but the logic is familiar. When power feels threatened, it often chooses security over sincerity. The story of Haile Selassie and the Derg is a warning about what happens when legal words and lived reality drift too far apart. When an emperor uses modernization to strengthen his image, but not to truly share power. When revolutionaries invoke the people to justify eliminating all constraints on themselves. Betrayal here is not just personal, it is structural. A repeated failure to honor the contracts, written and unwritten, that bind rulers to the ruled. Let's recap what we have learned in this episode. Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia for 44 years, was deposed on September 12, 1974, by a military committee called the Derg. That junta initially promised to preserve the monarchy in a constitutional form, but within 6 months it had abolished the throne and executed dozens of imperial officials and family members without trial. Long before his overthrow, Haile Selassie himself had violated a UN-backed federation by annexing Eritrea in 1962, sparking a 30-year war, and his government failed catastrophically during the Wollo famine of 1972-1975, when drought, feudal land structures, and political concealment combined to kill tens of thousands. On August 27, 1975, the emperor died under house arrest. The Derg claimed natural causes, but his body was secretly buried beneath a palace building, discovered only in 1992 after the regime fell in 1991. Later, court testimony in 2006 from former Derg members alleged that his death had been planned as a deliberate killing. The central pattern is clear. Promises made in constitutions, treaties, and proclamations were not kept. An emperor who partially modernized but would not yield real power, and revolutionaries who overthrew him, only to repeat the betrayal of their own ideals. You were listening to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened. Thank you for joining me in investigating the rise and fall of the Lion of Judah. The story of Haile Selassie is not one of simple villainy or simple virtue. It is a story about the human cost of power, the fragility of trust, and the way half-fulfilled promises can bring down both emperors and revolutions. If you found this episode compelling, please follow this podcast and leave a review wherever you listen. Your feedback helps ensure that complex histories like this one get the time, research, and care they deserve. Next time, we're investigating the story of Nelson Mandela, anti-apartheid activist and statesman who was the first president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. Until then, keep asking the hard questions. History has answers if we're willing to listen.